A practical checklist for donor stewardship. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by Dr. Geah Pressgrove. Geah is a professor at the University of West Virginia, where she teaches public relations, but also studies donor stewardship and fundraising. And Geah, what a delight to have you with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share some of my learnings with your audience.
So why does a professor, an expert researcher in areas like public relations and advertising, find herself researching donor stewardship?
Well, prior to becoming an academic and entering the academy, I was a practitioner. I worked in a public relations and advertising firm for almost a decade. And then after that, I was a freelancer for several years. And a lot of my work was working with the South Carolina Grantmakers Network, the nonprofits of the state, the foundations of the state, advocacy groups, political groups. And a lot of my work as a social scientist has been inspired by those days in industry.
And so working in the public relations industry, some of the customers were nonprofit organizations, fundraising coming up in that work. And Geah, that led you to take your expertise in public relations and take a look at aspects associated with effective donor stewardship. And the work we're doing here at the Fundraising School, during a literature review, we came across an article Geah put out in 2017 highlighting 26 practices of donor engagement, donor stewardship, and are they related to effective fundraising and donor relations? So Geah, before we talk about these 26 activities from fundraising, you organize them in 5 categories, and these categories come from public relations. Can you help our audience understand that, please?
Of course. So in looking at the academic literature, folks were talking about stewardship in a lot of ways, in the nonprofit literature, the public relations literature. And so I spent most of my time while working on my Ph.D. really deep diving into that literature and understanding what they were saying. And there were really 4 initial conceptualizations, or 4 domains or buckets, if you will, of stewardship. And some of this came from a woman named Kathleen Kelly's work, was based on her work. I stand on the shoulders of giants, and she is one of the giants in public relations who brought public relations from the nonprofit literature into this relationship building public relations context. And she said that there were 4 domains, or 4 buckets, if you will. They are relationship nurturing, so continuing to nurture the relationship and cultivate that relationship beyond the initial contact. Reporting, which is that fact-based work that we do to make sure that our donors and volunteers and other stakeholders understand how the funds have been used and their quantitative impact within a community. Responsibility, which is the more narrative storytelling, those emotional stories or the stories of the human impact and that human connection. And then the last one is reciprocity. So reciprocity was sort of having that, giving donors and volunteers and other community stakeholders in the nonprofit a voice in what it is that you're doing and shared responsibility. So in my research, I took all of the different ways that this had been measured, all the different items that might appear on a survey that you would give to a donor and say, how am I doing? And they would answer all these questions. And what I found was really it drilled down to 26 items that you could include in a questionnaire to determine how you're doing with regard to your donor. But I also found, as I continued to sort of parse and understand these dimensions, that reciprocity has 2 sides. Reciprocity meaning appreciation, which is more personal in nature, and reciprocity recognition. So donor dinners in their honor or naming rights and things of that nature. And that's a really important distinction because reciprocity is one of those things that it's not always positive. So there are, in some contexts, we have researched stewardship where we found that recognition actually negatively predicted trust and commitment and satisfaction within the nonprofit donor relationship, which we, through qualitative interviews and so forth and follow-up, have identified that that's because there's a concern of mismanagement of funds, that we want that personal appreciation as a donor, but we want that money to go directly to, we want to see the positive impacts towards mission fulfillment.
And if I'm understanding you correctly, that reciprocity was divided between regard and recognition. Regard, more
Correct.
Personal. I contact Geah personally. Recognition, it's more external. It's more public. Other people are learning about this. And so you were able to parse that out and create these 5 buckets. And, you know, for fundraisers, I just, so you look at the 26, I'm not going to list them all, but under reporting, you know, accurately reporting how the money is spent, you know, disclosing financial information about the organization in terms of regard. Again, the one-on-one, directly to the person, to the individual. The organization consistently thanks me for my involvement. Relationship nurturing continually communicates with people like me. That recognition, that external piece, again, takes a look at things like effectively acknowledges its supporters publicly, and then responsibility. This is an organization that is responsible, shares its stories about its mission, and there are many, many more. So again, just to let our audience know, these are highly practical, these 26 activities in these 5 categories. And again, Geah, for our practitioners, so please no R values, no alphas, anything like that. But what did you find overall regarding these 26 activities associated with donor stewardship?
And I think from the practical standpoint, it's also important to note I came from that professional background that I talked about earlier, but this scale was tested with United Ways across West Virginia across South Carolina. And the reason that I chose United Way, in part because I had a very good relationship with the United Ways because of my professional work, but also because they work across so many different issues and initiatives in local communities. So it was a good way to test, I think, the practicality of these. They also, both donors, philanthropists, and nonprofits were all part of getting to the point where I was even testing to see what the 26 ways were, the 26 items were that we measured it. And then from there, I took these stewardship items and I've continued to use them in other contexts. So we've looked at, from an international perspective, looking at museums. Recently, we did a study with these 5 dimensions and said, okay, how well are museums in an international context using best practices of stewardship in their websites? Are there ways that we can learn about how to improve our digital presence? We've done it with social media. We've done it with, we've done other surveys where we've been able to use it to use stewardship to predict important outcomes like trust, commitment, satisfaction, loyalty, and loyalty both in terms of effective loyalty. Like if somebody was talking to me about it, I would tell you how passionate I am about this nonprofit, but also behavioral loyalty. Like if I'm making a donation, this is the organization I think about most frequently. And we learned that these dimensions perform differently in different types of nonprofits and different types of contexts. So it's a good way to see what is important to your specific donor in different nonprofit contexts. So perhaps in an education versus religion, or healthcare versus pet care, different forms of stewardship are going to be important to those people for different reasons. And also generationally, they're different. So it's not just a way to see how you're doing, but how you're doing with specific audiences, how you're doing with specific campaigns. So it serves a lot of practical values. So I hope folks will use it and get back to me and tell me what you learned. It's a really useful tool.
The learning journey never ends. And Geah, if I could ask you, how would you summarize? Let's take this in 2 parts, please. How would you summarize that finding from 2017 in terms of those 26 activities? And then I'm going to ask you to say, okay, what were some of the major distinctions? You said wonderfully about, differences in terms of subsector and, online and international and generational and things like that. But how would you summarize first what you learned about those 26 aspects in that report back in 2017?
So part of the impetus for this was my professional career. And then also part of it was, as a social scientist, I'm just curious, right? Like I like to figure out how to measure things in a way that's functional and practical. And what I learned is that there are donors who have different perspectives on how their funds should be used, large versus small, generationally, et cetera. And also what the outcomes are in terms of what it means for my mission fulfillment as a nonprofit leader, for instance. So is it most important to me to have trust or satisfaction or that long-term loyalty to a particular cause? So there are some causes or some initiatives that are short-term, but how do you build after that initial connection with an audience? So I think it has the ability to, I don't want to say transform, that's overly overly grandiose or overly braggadocious to say that this has the ability to transform, but it can really give insights in a way that anybody can do. Any practitioner, any nonprofit leader doesn't have to hire a social scientist like me, doesn't have to hire a professional research firm and spend thousands of dollars to get some really solid insights about their user base and their donor base. So I love using the things and the tools that I learn as an academic in a way that can help industries that I care about, particularly the nonprofit and philanthropic spaces.
So we want to emphasize, we can look at these 26 activities as a starting point, apply them to your context of your nonprofit, your subsector, your donor base, but they are a highly reliable starting point for you to be thinking about practical activities for donor stewardship. And Geah, as this learning journey has continued, what are maybe one or two findings since then, where you're like, that's a distinction. That really jumped out. That is a very important difference here. Do you have a kind of a list of favorites that really catch your attention in a larger way?
So what I've been working on recently is a book project with Routledge that is taking stewardship and converting it from solely being used in the nonprofit sector and sort of broadening its appeal for public relations practitioners as a guiding philosophy for leadership. And as part of that, I've talked to public relations practitioners, so people who work in communication spaces across different industries around the globe. So I've talked to people in Saudi Arabia, and I've talked to people in Asia, and I've talked to people in Latin America, you name it. And I found that I think there is an emerging domain that may help add clarity to what our relationship nurturing is in the contemporary landscape. And so instead of just being about inviting a audience into the conversation through an event or ongoing communication like a newsletter, it's really much more about respect, which encompasses a little bit more. So it's not just that one-way communication of you give me information or you ask me to come to something, but respecting my opinion in a way that really brings me along and really shows me that my relationship with you is important and that you see me as an individual and everything that I bring to the table and you respect that. So we're still working with that. We're still teasing out, is it a different dimension than, or a different sort of bucket to measure, to look at? Is it specific to the leadership space that we're talking about respect, or does that also work in other public relations contexts like nonprofit relationship development?
And you had mentioned earlier, I'd like to invite you to expand upon some of the other research that you conducted where you saw a difference in a particular subsector or a difference with a particular generation. Does anything really come to mind that, again, really caught your attention as the research has evolved?
I mean, some of it is to be expected. So when you talk to younger generations, college age, whether in college or not, but that age group, responsibility to them really matters. So seeing the human impact, way more important than reporting. They really value that appreciation piece, but it's almost level with the reporting piece, because I think there's an anticipation that their small donation, their $10 donation to the local pellet shelter is going to be less impactful than a multi-$1,000 donor. That large donors and sort of regular size donors, both in terms of that personal appreciation versus the recognition, that recognition, the naming rights and the things that we've historically done as nonprofits to recognize donors and show that we appreciate them, those naming rights kinds of things and those big public displays are not as important and not as desirable. To some extent, that may be because of the continual ask that happens once they're recognized as a donor. And in other instances, it's a belief that misappropriation of funds, that the funds should be going to mission fulfillment. In terms of websites, that we see that that relationship nurturing is all over the website. Sometimes they're telling stories, but the donate, the join, the be a part of, all of these different ways that you might cultivate a relationship with someone coming to your website are the dominant prevalent messages, and less so about those important narratives that provide the human connection. You can't, I always tell, I'm a professor too, so I always tell my students, you can't develop a relationship with bricks and mortar. You have to develop a relationship with a human being. So making sure that the story that is being told is not just an ask, that it really is a sharing something that you can create a relationship with.
Yeah, those are wonderful summaries of what has been advancing in your wonderful research translated to practical application. And Geah, as we conclude, I just wonder, just what advice do you have for fundraisers, just overall in this area of donor relations, donor engagement, donor stewardship, why it's important, what they can be doing, what it means for cultivating a longer term relationship with their donors. I know it can be difficult because you've written so many articles, now you're working on a book and all of that. It's wonderful. We look forward to that. But, how would you summarize your advice for fundraisers in this work?
So I think the generation that is coming of age now is going to have a lot of power and potential of the pocket, of the purse, if you will. And from a donor's or from the donor cultivation perspective, don't write them off their $10 donation, and establishing a relationship with them and cultivating that relationship is going to have long-term ramifications. I know oftentimes we're looking at, major endowments or major gifts. And sometimes those are what's going to make the nonprofit continue to run. But engaging these younger people and looking at ways to steward that relationship over time is going to have long-lasting impacts for your organization. And then as you bring on even those endowed donors, oftentimes, and I've seen in reviewing some of your podcasts and our earlier conversations, that a lot of times we get those big donors and now it's on to the next one. Failing to cultivate those relationships means that you're going to lose that gift in the future. You're not going to have that same level of behavioral and affective loyalty that you're going to have if you put some effort into stewarding those relationships.
And just some other data points in support of Geah's advice. According to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, only about 40 to 45% of first-time donors will come back. However, when we get to that second and the gifts after the second gift, 70 to 80% of your donors will stay with you longer term. And we're always recruiting new donors, but of course, it costs less money and takes less time to work with our existing donors, which just frees up time and money to help us identify the next donors as well. And I would also suggest to our audience that if you are getting that, your CEO, your board are saying, hey, go to the next donor, a list like this that Geah's provided for us is an opportunity for you to lead up, with research, evidence-based content to say, yes, I know I need to be cultivating with the next donors, but here's some evidence that shows that working with our current donors and staying in touch with them also is beneficial to our nonprofit. Dr. Geah Pressgrove, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and translating it all to effective fundraising practice for us here on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thank you. It's been great to chat with you, and I look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Very, very much the same here. Thank you. And donor stewardship is covered in so many of our courses, 25 in all at the Fundraising School, that lead to 5 different certificates and a new pop-up course on donor stewardship, building long-term relationships with your donors. We have customized training where we can, take parts of courses and knit them together for your tailored needs. And we can do this in person, online, in the United States, anywhere across the world. We have quarterly webinars and these weekly podcasts. And our knowledge is gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in the book's 5th edition. Where do we find this information? Online at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. I'm grateful for our producers today, Jennifer Boffman, CFRM, and our Emmy Award-winning producer, Mike Anthony. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.